Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first Supertext Freelancer webinar, Down to Details, Proofreading at Supertext. My name is Frances Provine, and I'm the head of the English team at Supertext. Because this is our very first webinar like this, I want to apologize in advance for any technical issues you may experience. If you took part in the Freelancer convention, you are probably already familiar with the Teams live event platform, but if not, I wanted to give you a few tips. Firstly, you will see a pause button at the bottom of the screen. Please do not click this or you will no longer be live. You should also see an icon with a speech bubble with the question mark in the taskbar. You can use this channel to ask questions during the Q&A at the end. If you have technical issues during the presentation, you can also write them in the Q&A channel during the presentation, and a member of our IT team will answer you directly. Please also note that this presentation is being recorded. I'm not sure she's listening in, but I'd like to thank Melanie Keller, the former head of the German team at Supertext, whose research on this topic I used in putting together this presentation. Another reminder, this presentation will be held in English, but is relevant for proofreaders of all languages. However, the examples will all be in English. I'll be covering a lot of different aspects of proofreading today. A lot may already be familiar to you, but I hope you'll still learn something new and get some tips on how to become a more thorough proofreader. Before I go through the schedule for the day, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I chose to hold a webinar on proofreading. Well, as a language manager, proofreading is actually one of the hardest services to recruit for. Not because there aren't any freelancers that offer it, but because it's almost entirely unregulated. This means that while a lot of people offer proofreading, very few have been trained or know what to expect. Translation is also considered an unregulated field, but there are still plenty of translation degree programs, workshops, and certifications related to translation. There is a translation-specific ISO certification outlining minimum qualifications, and there isn't for proofreading. Yes, there is an ISO certification for post-editing and an ISO certification for quality assurance, but those really don't get into specifically proofreading requirements. With a few exceptions, most translation schools don't focus on proofreading at all. There also aren't very many proofreading or editing specific workshops out there. But since more than 200 of you signed up for this, I think there's a pretty big demand for it. Here is an outline of what I'll cover in this webinar. First, I'll talk briefly about why proofreading matters. Then I'll get into the science behind proofreading and why it's actually much harder than it seems. I'll talk about the different proofreading and revision services that Supertext offers. Terms like proofreading and editing are used differently by various agencies and freelancers, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll go through the fundamentals of proofreading, including things like style guides and process. Then I'll talk about software considerations. These days, most proofreading is done on a screen, which presents a few challenges. Proofreading in Word is different from Adobe or Trotos, and there are different advantages and disadvantages to each program. Finally, I'll get into some tips and tricks, including the do's and don'ts of proofreading, and also list some proofreading resources you might find useful. And at the end, I'll answer your questions in a Q&A. By the way, if you have any of your own personal proofreading tips you'd like to share during the Q&A, I invite you to post them at the end as well. First, why does proofreading matter? Well, the Supertext marketing team has come up with a tagline that captures exactly why. You might have already seen this line somewhere on the Supertext website. It's actually a translation from German, but also works well in English. And while there may be a typo, it's certainly true that one wrong letter or one wrong number can ruin a text. Think about an annual report. What happens if someone forgets to add a 0 to the end of a company's year-end result? It's actually a very easy mistake to make, but it's very hard for a proofreader to catch. But if a shareholder or board member thinks that their investment has performed a tenth as well as it has, it can really blow up in a company's face. The easiest things to miss can have the worst consequences. Let's say you're proofreading a translation and the translator hasn't seen the word not in the source text. If you don't catch that, the sentence is going to have the opposite meaning of what it's supposed to. And I've seen it happen before. And let's say the mistake is less serious. A word is misspelled, but you can tell what the author is getting at. It can still undermine your trust in the author of the text, as well as the company behind them. The final result is not only a less pleasant, more distracting experience for the reader, but also less effective marketing for a client. As a customer, you might not feel comfortable using a website with a lot of mistakes on it to make payments, for example. Or even if you do feel comfortable using the website, the information might just be really unclear. What's more, we're living in a world where the sheer amount of text we read is exploding because of the internet. This text is often written quickly and includes mistakes. But even with machine translation improving, its proofreading counterpart, automated spell and grammar checks, remain relatively stalled. We don't yet live in a world where proofreaders have become obsolete, and we probably never will. So proofreaders are important. Now let's dig into the science behind proofreading, or more specifically, why proofreading is actually so hard. Now, some of you might have encountered this paragraph or something similar. Can you understand what it means? According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without problem. This example is in English, but you can probably find similar examples in your own native languages. Let's look at another one. Here, the letters are in the right order, but some of them have been replaced by similar-looking digits. Still, if you speak English fluently, you'll probably be able to read this without problem. How? Well, our brains are built to make decisions quickly and understand things based on incomplete information. This is called pattern recognition. Here is a quote on this phenomenon from an article in Wired magazine from a while back. As with all high-level tasks, your brain generalizes simple component parts, like turning letters into words and words into sentences, so it can focus on more complex tasks, like combining sentences into complex ideas. An important paradox related to this is that strong writers and strong translators are not always the best proofreaders. In fact, people who read a lot for pleasure will tend to process text even more efficiently, which is great for comprehension, but not for catching errors. What this tells us is that reading for pleasure and proofreading take two very different approaches. Another idea I'd like to bring up is this concept from linguistics. Noam Chomsky distinguishes between what he calls mistakes versus errors. Mistakes, according to this definition, represent a failure in performance, whereas errors are a failure in competence. Mistakes are what we make when we are rushed or tired, whereas errors are what we make when we speak or write in a language we don't master or about a field we don't fully understand. Think about the corrections you make when you proofread texts. Which of your clients make mistakes and which make errors? When do you make mistakes and when do you make errors? Avoiding mistakes takes practice and developing a systematic approach, whereas errors require a bit of re-education. And remember, no matter how skilled you are, We all make both mistakes and errors. All right, let's get into different proofreading services. In English, there are a number of different words used to describe various proofreading and revision services, often interchangeably. As a matter of fact, the terms for these services have even changed several times at Supertext. Copy editing, revision, reviewing, proofreading, editing, line editing, proofing. Well, I'll explain once and for all how Supertext defines these. So first we have our two most basic forms of monolingual revision. That means proofreading and editing are both in a single language and often aren't translations. What we now call editing used to be referred to as revision in the Super system. Both of these services have a lot in common. They are both single-step processes, so performed by one person. Both involve reviewing spelling, orthography, and grammar. Both ensure consistency with a style guide as well as throughout the text. They also both include a certain degree of research and fact-checking, for example, verifying titles, names, institutions, and so on. The key distinction is that editing also involves making stylistic changes to a text, while proofreading does not. If a client wants a text proofread, it should mean they have full faith in the stylistic integrity of the text, or that the text has already been approved for style by a boss or by a legal department. One way of distinguishing these two services is to think of proofreading as largely objective, while editing is in large part subjective. When proofreading, you only make changes that are absolutely necessary to ensure grammatical and factual accuracy. Meanwhile, when you edit and make stylistic changes, you're inevitably going to let your personal opinion of what constitutes good writing influence your changes. Another thing to keep in mind is that proofreading, so not making any stylistic changes, usually only makes sense if a text is already well written. Most texts written by non-native speakers are going to need some stylistic improvements. This includes things like rewording sentences to change them from passive to active, cutting out or replacing words, shortening sentences, or changing the register or tone of a text. Here is a concrete example comparing proofreading and editing. Here you can see the types of changes made for each service. Rewriting is another monolingual revision service. This used to be called editing in our system, which led to a lot of confusion among freelancers. Rewriting is in between editing and copywriting. The focus is less on grammar and orthography and more on style and composition. Since you're generally rewriting the text from top to bottom, including making structural changes, you won't necessarily track your changes the way you would for proofreading or editing. You might get a briefing from the client detailing the impact they want the text to have. And finally, the text is proofread by a second person after being rewritten, so it's a two-step process. Here is an example of rewriting. If you read the before text, there actually aren't any grammatical or spelling errors. So if you sent it through to be proofread, no changes would be made at all. The after text, however, has been rewritten to be more engaging and appropriate for a blog post, which is where this example comes from. But for a different platform or audience, it might be rewritten in a completely different way. Next, we have bilingual review, which might be what most of you are used to. This used to be called proof and cross-reading in the Super system, which I frankly never found easy to understand. This is where you are revising a translated text and comparing it to the source text. At Supertext, most of these will probably be texts that have been translated by another Supertext translator, though sometimes clients will ask us to edit texts they have translated themselves. How many stylistic changes need to be made, if any, really depends on the quality of the translation. The translation needs to be accurate, both in terms of meaning and tone. This does not mean it should be a word-for-word literal translation, but rather that it should capture the register of the source text. You'll also need to review grammar inconsistency and research titles, like with a normal proofreading job. Another specific thing to watch out for in translations are company designations. For example, if a company is registered as a public limited company or Aktiengesellschaft. For Swiss companies, this can be checked in the trade register at cefix.ch. Because these designations are each unique, they should not be used interchangeably unless specifically registered. You also should check that links are properly localized and resolve translator comments or questions as much as possible. The other bilingual service I'll touch on is post-editing of machine translation. This is an area where Supertext is just starting out, though demand is increasing a lot. My colleague Lucas did a presentation on machine translation at the Supertext Freelancer convention that is available on YouTube, so I won't go into too much detail here. I will mention, however, that there are two kinds of post-editing: full post-editing and light post-editing. Full post-editing means editing empty output so that the target comes close to a human translation, whereas in light post-editing, the only corrections made are those that impact meaning or understanding. This table goes into more detail and is included in a guide on post-editing that is uploaded to the info portal on your Supertext Freelancer page. Here's an example of the differences, also available in the guide uploaded to the info portal. Light post-editing is only used for internal texts, where quantity is more important than quality. Light post-editing should never be used for a text that will be published externally, for example, on a public website. Furthermore, because the quality of empty output still varies so much, sometimes it can take as long to translate a text from scratch as it does to perform even a full post-edit. The final service I'll discuss is quote-unquote ready to print proofreading. This is a final review of a text that has already been proofread or edited once and then put into its final format, often a PDF. Because the text has already gone through at least one round of revisions, the proofreader is really checking to make sure the text is perfect before it gets published on paper. This includes checking layout issues such as line breaks, spacing, end-of-line hyphenation, typeface consistency, and so on. It also means cross-checking page numbers with the table of contents, things of that nature. The proofreader should also make note of any final typos that appear in the text. Rather than being mistakes on the part of the author or things missed by the first proofreader or editor, these typos are often the result of changes implemented by graphic designers. To give you an idea of how long each of these services take, here are Supertext's words per hour estimates. Obviously, these are all approximate estimates, and the amount of words per hour really varies depending on how technical the text is, how many numbers there are to check, and so on. Compare these estimates with how many words per hour you read when you read for pleasure. There's a huge difference. Make sure you take the time you need when you proofread or edit. Rushing is the enemy of accuracy. Remember what I mentioned about the way our brain tends to simplify things when processing information quickly? Now that I've explained our different services, I'm going to talk about the fundamentals of proofreading, from style guides to process to how to research. Most of what I'll say here is specifically for proofreading and editing, rather than for rewriting or post-editing. First of all, style guides. Before you proofread anything, you should have a specific style guide in mind. For German, you'll probably be reaching for Duden, but in English, it's not so clear-cut. You've got Hart's rules for UK English, the Associated Press style book, the Chicago Manual of Style, APA style, New York Times style. It goes on and on. And unfortunately, a lot of the rules are inconsistent. Some style guides favor double quotation marks, others favor single. Chicago style favors the serial comma, while Associated Press does not. But since consistency is one of the most important aspects of proofreading, you'll need to have a style guide in mind before you begin. A lot of clients helpfully have their own style guide, in which case you should prioritize that. If a client doesn't have its own style guide, Supertext has style guides for English, German, French, and Italian. For all Supertext clients that do not have their own style guides, you should stick to the Supertext style guide. Generally, the Supertext style guide will cover most issues, but if you have a style question that does not fall under its scope, go for the Associated Press style book for US English and the Oxford Style Guide, also known as Hart's Rules, for UK English. Unfortunately, I'm not personally familiar with the favorite style guides in languages besides English and German. Now, if you are an experienced proofreader, you should know the respective style guides in and out. But let's say you're just starting out, or you've gotten a 50-page style guide from a brand new client. How do you keep track of what to check for? It can be helpful to summarize the most important things to look out for or make a checklist. Here's an example of what I mean. A short list like this is a lot less intimidating than a 100-page style guide. Better yet, have a look through the text you're going to proofread before making corrections and make note of the things you'll need to check for. Does the text have a lot of dates? Make sure you know the standard date format that you want to use so you can check for consistency. Are there a lot of numbers? Quotes? Before changing anything, know the rules. Now that you've familiarized yourself with a style guide, let's get started proofreading. A good proofreader will have a systematic approach to going through the text, and they will read through the text multiple times. The first step, ideally, is to read through the entire text once before making changes. What is the text about? What kind of text is it, and who is the target audience? Are there a lot of names, numbers, or other special issues that you'll need to keep in mind as you proofread? After this initial read-through, begin actually proofreading. Read through the text again, taking your time. Check for spelling as you go. You will still do a final spell check at the end, but there are plenty of words that won't be picked up by an automatic spell checker. Check the accuracy of the text. Let's say you're proofreading a text about the American Civil War. Double check the dates and the names of the generals. Review grammatical issues, and if you're editing, review style as well. If you have even the slightest doubt about anything, hyphenation rules, quotation marks, look it up in the style guide or check the client's website. Don't make assumptions. Make note of any terms that you are unsure of in order to check them later. Make a checklist of any incorrect words, numbers, names, titles, and so on that appear multiple times in the text so that you can search for them at the end to make sure they're consistent. Double check proper nouns like people's names, product names, companies, and their designations. Verify numbers, addresses, phone numbers, and so on if possible. Now you're ready for a final check of the text. Check the formatting if required, for example, if the text is in its final layout. Perform searches for things like double spaces, apostrophes, and quote marks, which are often inconsistent, as well as words that appear multiple times and are spelled inconsistently. For example, in English, Düsseldorf is sometimes spelled with an umlaut over the U and sometimes without an umlaut over the U. Please do not use the umlaut in Düsseldorf or Zurich if it is in an English text. Finally, read through the final version of the text again with the track changes hidden to spot any final issues. And at the end, always run an automated spell check. It might not catch everything, but there is absolutely no excuse for any mistakes a client ends up discovering when they perform a spell check themselves. Let's chat quickly about research. As I'm sure you are aware, not all sources are created equal. While the internet makes our research much easier, it's definitely a double-edged sword. For every factual, well-researched website, there are dozens of terribly researched, factually incorrect, and terribly translated ones. And please never ever automatically trust anything you see on social media. Make sure you're using trustworthy news sources when you are fact-checking or researching names, dates, and so on. Website endings can help you assess the quality of the site. .edu is the ending for universities in the US, while endings like .gov for the US and admin.ch for Switzerland indicate that those are official government websites. If you're looking up product names, the best place to look is the website of the client you're proofreading for. However, be careful with random e-commerce websites. A lot of these are just Google translations, and you don't want to rely on them too much for terminology. It's better to just query the client. Another tip is to always check against multiple sources. If you've ever double-checked famous quotes, you will have hopefully learned this lesson by now. There are a lot of famous quotes out there that are attributed to the wrong person or attributed to multiple people. But if a piece of information is consistent across a lot of different websites, you can feel a little bit more confident that it's legitimate. Also, beware of Wikipedia. It's a great source for general background information, but it can be edited by almost anyone, and you shouldn't list it as a source to a client. But the sources listed at the bottom of a Wikipedia page can be a bit more trustworthy. Lastly, use Google wisely. There are a number of tricks for getting the most out of Google. For one thing, Google's search algorithms are often a lot more sophisticated than client websites or news sites' search algorithms. So if you're looking for a keyword on a certain site, you can type out site : with the website along with the keyword in quote marks. This search might be a lot more effective than searching on the website directly. Another great feature of Google is the image search. If you're trying to figure out if a technical term has been translated properly, for example, you can compare the pictures that show up when you search for images of the source word versus pictures that come up for the target word. Obviously, this isn't a perfect strategy, but in this case, you're looking at results across a number of websites. And finally, if you're not sure which version of a word is more common, for example, website as 2 words versus website as 1 word, you can also look up each version in Google, surrounded by quotation marks, to see how many hits each version has. Just to emphasize how careful we need to be with the internet, I looked up the words London Daily in Google. That's not the name of any official newspaper I'm aware of, but it sounds like it could be, couldn't it? Well, at least 4 different sites came up when I searched this. There's londondaily.com, london-daily.com, londondailypost.com, and londondailyreport.com. London-daily.com seems to just regurgitate news stories picked up by Google News, which itself is run by algorithms, not by actual fact checkers, journalists, or editors. But having a quick look at each of these sites, it's not clear if any of them are writing their own content or where they're getting their information from. So I can't emphasize enough, be careful with your sources. Another thing I need to highlight is consistency. Emerson once said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." He apparently wasn't a big fan of consistency, and neither are many writers. But consistency is very important to readers and clients. In a printed text, it can impact the aesthetics of a text, so how it looks. And for readers, inconsistencies can be very distracting and can negatively impact comprehension. For example, if you use multiple words to represent the same technical tool, will readers know you're talking about the same thing? You should try to make the reader's job as simple and enjoyable as possible. And what does consistency apply to? Everything, basically. Here's a list of areas where I have encountered inconsistencies in proofreading or finalizing texts. Date formats, for example, where a date is written out sometimes and abbreviated other times. Number formats, like when a comma is used to separate thousands in one place and not in other places. Spelling, terminology. Professional titles, when somebody is called a manager in one place and head in another place. Capitalization, especially of headers and subheaders. Tables of contents. Sometimes a chapter title will be written differently in the table of contents than at the start of a chapter. Same with page numbers and section numbers. Are they in the correct order, or are any numbers skipped or repeated? Is the formatting, spacing, indentation, typeface, and so on consistent? What about citation, both within the text, including the formatting of book and article titles, and in a bibliography at the end? Bullet points. Is the punctuation at the end of the bullet points or lack of punctuation consistent? And then there's hyphenation, including end of line hyphenation. There are a lot of things to keep track of. Okay, now let's talk about technology. While many people still prefer to proofread on paper, most proofreading these days is at least partly digital. While this presents its own challenges, reading on a screen is slower, for example, the tools we use can also help us in many key ways. I'm going to go through the most common softwares used for proofreading and show you how you can use them to your advantage. First, there's Microsoft Word. This is probably where you're doing most of your proofreading these days. Luckily, Word has a lot of features that can help with proofreading. It can be helpful to add the features you use the most to your quick access toolbar at the top of the screen. This way, when you need to do a spell check or perform a search, you just need to click on the corresponding icon at the top rather than navigating between different tabs to look for that feature. There are also shortcuts like F7 for the spell checker. And speaking of the spell and grammar check, always do it. It bears repeating. It isn't perfect. It isn't perfect though. Make sure you use it carefully and check each word before letting Word automatically change it or ignoring it. And frankly, I find the grammar check to be mostly pretty terrible, at least for English. Similarly, you should be careful when you use the find and replace function. Have a think before clicking replace all. If the case-sensitive feature isn't ticked, it can lead to inconsistent or incorrect capitalization. In addition to automatically performing a spell check at the end of proofreading a document in Word, search for double spaces. It's something that's very easy to do, so again, there's no real excuse. Unless you have been instructed otherwise, always track your changes when proofreading in Word. If you find the markup distracting, you can change the settings to hide them. As I already mentioned, I recommend going through the document with the track changes hidden when finishing up a proofreading job. Another helpful feature is the read aloud function. A common trick when writing or proofreading is to read a text aloud to catch mistakes. With the read aloud feature, the computer will speak the words for you. If you're proofreading a translation, you can listen to the translation being read aloud and read the source text at the same time, which can help you catch things like missing words or mistranslations. And finally, another thing to keep in mind is the paragraph view, also known as the show and hide feature. If you have this enabled, you'll be able to see spaces and hidden text. This is another way to catch double spaces or other odd formatting issues. Here I've included a few screenshots so you can see the features I mean. There's the quick access toolbar at the very top of your screen in Word. Then the track changes feature under the review tab where you can toggle between all markup, which shows all your changes, no changes, which shows the clean final version, and original, which is the non-proofread text. The read aloud function is also in the review tab. The paragraph view mode is the little backwards P in the Home tab, and Find Replace is also in the Home tab. These screenshots show you how the paragraph view works. In the first paragraph, the paragraph view is enabled, and in the second, it's not. You're able to see spaces represented by dots and hidden text with a faint dotted underline. Both of these are invisible when the mode is disabled. Next, we have Adobe, the tool often used for proofreading PDFs. We also have a guide on proofreading PDFs uploaded to the info portal that goes into more detail. There are a few things to keep in mind when proofreading in Adobe or proofreading PDFs generally. For one thing, the text can often be formatted in a hard-to-read way, for example, as a tiny footnote at the bottom or as a speech bubble that's easy to miss. Make sure you scan the whole page when you proofread. Sometimes proofreaders tend to focus on running text and forget to check picture captions or even headers. Another issue with Adobe is that it doesn't have an integrated spell check. This means you might want to copy and paste the text into Word and run a spell check there if you have the time and the formatting doesn't prevent you from doing so. An important aspect of proofreading in Adobe is using the correct markup tools. If you go to the Comment tab, you should see these tools at the top, which include Insert, Delete, and Replace. Do not use sticky notes or other comments to make changes, as they simply aren't clear enough. The tools actually operate quite intuitively. For example, if you highlight a word and begin typing as you would to replace a term when using Word, the corresponding markup will be automatically applied, so replace text. And speaking of comments, keep in mind that the person implementing these changes is probably a graphic designer or DTP specialist and not a linguist. Much of the time, they don't even speak the language of the text. This means that if you do decide to leave comments, make sure they're as straightforward and easy to understand as possible, ideally in a language the client speaks. Finally, since a lot of jobs in Adobe have already been revised once, and this is possibly the last time they're getting reviewed before being published, it's often important to check the formatting. Here's a screenshot showing where the tools are and what they look like, as well as the kinds of comments that are appropriate. If you make a small change that's hard to see and easy for the graphic designer to miss, then you're encouraged to add a short comment like delete comma or Komma entfernen in German, set in square brackets to distinguish it from running text. And last but not least, we have Trotos. Here we also have some special considerations. Again, a lot of this information is already in a proofreading checklist you can download from the info portal. First of all, you can use the filter options in the review tab to help you out. For example, let's say you're proofreading an annual report or catalog with a long list of numbers. You can use the numbers only filter to hone in on these and check them more carefully. Since auto-propagation doesn't always handle numbers only segments well, this is really helpful. You can also filter out translation units with track changes if you want to check over the changes you've made. Studio 2021 has some expanded filter options, so make sure to check them out. There are also some STL plugins out there that can be very helpful. I personally haven't had much luck with the number verifier, but I highly recommend the subtitling and SRT file type plugins, which allow you to integrate a video into Trotos when translating or proofreading subtitles. Go to this STL plugin store and play around. Another important thing to consider are fuzzy matches. Fuzzy matches are wonderful for translators, but can often be deceptive for proofreaders. A 95% match can be basically identical to a TM match, or it can have a completely different date or number, or include the word not. So make sure not to rush through them. You can also filter out fuzzy matches to double check those. For a big, important job with a lot of fuzzy matches, this can be really useful. If you have auto-propagation enabled, when you make a change in one segment and confirm it, that change will be applied to all matching segments in the file, so we recommend having it activated. But again, auto-propagation doesn't always do a great job with numbers, so make sure to check those even if Trotos recognizes them as matches. Then we have terminology. Trotos has a couple of ways of helping you use the correct terminology. There's the term base, as well as the concordance search, which allows you to look up specific terms or phrases in the translation memory. But remember, source documentation is always the most important place to check for terms. If you notice a term that is translated differently in these different places, prioritize the translation in the source document, then the term base, and lastly the TM. And yes, there's more. Trotos does have an integrated spell checker. In fact, it has two different spell checkers, Hunspell and Microsoft Word. While Hunspell is the default spell check used by Trotos, the MS Word spell checker is much more reliable. So I would recommend adjusting your settings to use that one. Then there's the Verify feature, or Quality Assurance Checker. Supertext has a customized QA checker settings profile attached to all jobs. You should run this check at the end of every job you proofread. A lot of the warnings probably won't be relevant, but still check each of them. You can also adapt the way the font looks in Trotos. Trotos will often automatically show the font, size, and color of the source document in the Trotos editor view. But Not all fonts and colors are easy to read. If you go to the font adaptation settings, you can adapt the font to be shown in a certain minimum and maximum size in the Trotos editor view, so you won't hurt your eyes. This will not impact the font in the final exported text. Use the preview option to see the text in its final format, for example, as it would look in Word. You can either create a preview file, which will open the translation in the respective software in its target format, or use an integrated preview function that shows the layout within Trotos. Tags often include important formatting information, so make sure any relevant tags in the source are included in the target segment in the correct position. And finally, shortcuts. These can make your life much easier, so get familiar with them. F7 is the shortcut for spell check, like in Word, and F8 is the shortcut for the QA checker. Again, here are a few screenshots to show you where you can find these features and settings. A lot of the most useful functions for proofreaders are in the Review tab. You're also expected to track changes for all bilingual jobs in Trotos unless otherwise instructed. Similar to Word, you can toggle between Show Markup and Final Version, so with track changes and without them, if you find the look distracting. You can also find the filter, search, check spelling, and verify features there. You can change the spelling settings, so change from the Hun spell checker to the MS Word spell checker by going to Options, Editor, and then Spelling. You can also customize your shortcuts and adapt the font under Options. I have my minimum font size set to 14 and maximum font size set to 20. Well, now that I've bombarded you with a lot of information, I thought I would end the webinar with a few tips and tricks for proofreading. The first one is to read the text aloud. This can help you both catch mistakes, as well as better understand how a text flows and check the style. Another tip is to proofread in the morning or whenever you feel the most awake and sharp. Obviously, this isn't always possible, but it's important to note that it's usually not a good idea to proofread when you're feeling very tired. Another tip is to zoom in on a text in order to be able to read it more easily and look at things like punctuation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's really helpful to keep a checklist of things to review to help ensure consistency. And again, always do a final read through of the text. When you're making corrections, you're often starting and stopping to research things. It's good to read through the whole thing one last time to make sure you didn't miss anything in the process. As I mentioned before, a lot of people find proofreading on paper easier than on a screen. But of course, these days, it's hard to get away from digital track changes when proofreading. And again, read slowly. Alongside those tricks, I put together a list of do's and don'ts based on everything I've already shared. So do review the relevant style guides and read the full text up front. Use technology to your advantage. Get familiar with the tools at your disposal. Do double check names, institutions, dates, and figures where possible. Do ensure that the changes are visible by using track changes or the markup tools. And finally, offer alternatives for unclear language. If you're proofreading or editing and you come across a sentence that isn't clear, don't just write the comment unclear. If you think you know what the author is getting at, offer an alternative wording that makes more sense. And if you're really lost about what the sentence means, try to be specific in your comment about what you don't understand. And then there are the don'ts. Don't change specialist terms from the term base without consulting the client. Don't change the meaning of a sentence. The client is hiring you to polish their style, not create content. You don't want to introduce inaccurate information. Similarly, don't make unnecessary stylistic changes for straight proofreading jobs. When you make significant changes to a text, you're more likely to introduce new typos. And again, to really bring the point home, don't leave vague or excessively long comments. Make your comments as easy to understand for the client as possible. Try not to leave an excessive number of comments either. These can often just create more work for the client or language manager. Try to answer as many questions as you can through research. To end with, I've put together a list of resources that could interest you. This is far from an exhaustive list, but it's a start. This includes a few style manuals, a book on proofreading translations, and of course the ever-relevant Elements of Style by Strunk and White. Style guides are frequently updated, so I would recommend getting an online subscription to one or all of these style guides to stay current. The online versions are constantly updated. Here are a few resources for German as well. I got most of these from my colleagues, so I can't really speak about them too much. Finally, I wanted to remind you again of the offerings in our Freelancer info portal. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, we have created a number of documents with more detailed information on everything you heard today and made them easy for you to download. Most of these are also available in all 4 of our main languages: English, German, French, and Italian. There is also the document Häufige Fehler, or Common Mistakes for German freelancers. With that, let's get started with the Q&A. Are there any questions? And also I wanted to remind you, you can feel free to share your own proofreading tips in the Q&A tab also. Okay, so the first question is, when is it okay to leave comments in a text I am proofreading or editing? So I think this is a really important question. You need to keep in mind who the client is. I think that a lot of freelance proofreaders tend to leave as many comments as possible to kind of show the author of the text that they've, thought about the different issues raised, and that they've really been thinking about the text a lot. But the issue is, for a private client, that's fine. The client might prefer that. But for a big company, the person who is implementing the changes might not even be the author of the text. So when they see a lot of comments, they don't really know what to do with them. So I would say you should leave comments when it comes to questions about content. So terminology, or if something is really unclear, then that should definitely be commented. But if it's a linguistic issue, for example, I've sometimes seen a freelancer will put a comment like, oh, I think this would be worded better this way for an editing job. In that case, just make the edit. Don't leave a comment, because then I, as a language manager, or the client, is just going to have to copy that sentence and then paste it in. So it's more work for us. Second, you mentioned fact-checking and researching a lot, but isn't that the author or translator's job? Yes, absolutely. So I think with sort of fact-checking and researching, most of the texts we get at Supertext are, we're not going to know the numbers if it's if they're talking about their own employees, employee numbers, those kind of things. We're not going to be able to even fact check that anyway. And yes, the author and the translator, it is their job to double check those things. But I'm sort of referring to things that are really easy to check. If you have a name and really, to check names, all you need to do is look on LinkedIn, or it doesn't take too many extra searches. So I think it's something that proofreaders still really need to keep in mind. But yeah, I'm referring to things that are pretty easy to check, not like fact checking as a newspaper would. Stephen Gray, I'm pretty sure that auto-propagation in Trotos will only change matches retrospectively if you have that setting selected. Therefore, you need to make sure what your settings are before assuming that it will change all the other segments within the file that are the same as in the one you are changing. Yeah, so that's a really good, important tip. There are a few different settings for auto-propagation. So I think the main ones are, disabling auto-propagation entirely. Then you have auto-propagate from the segment down, and then you also have auto-propagate all matching segments in the file. So I would say, I think for Supertext jobs, it's good to have at least one of those second two settings, so either from the top down or all of the segments. When you wouldn't, like one instance where you would maybe just want it going down rather than automatically changing all the matching segments is if you have a file where maybe in one instance it's a headline, and so it needs to be shorter. So in that case, you wouldn't necessarily want all of the matching segments to be auto-propagated. Adrian Lambert, what's your general opinion about the overuse from a non-native speaker's point of view of capital letters in English? Any differences between UK and US English? Do you correct it, or do you consider it to be a feature of the author's style? Oh, I love this question. So I am from the US, if some of you understand, and I think the use of capital letters is more favored in the US than in the UK. So in the UK, you have headlines are generally only the first letter is capitalized. And in the US, it tends to be more towards the other way. So headlines are often capitalized. That said, Associated Press style, which is the main style used by the Associated Press wire, the news wire, is also only the first letter capitalized. At Supertext, we prefer not excessively capitalizing titles. So that is definitely something we change when we're editing text. But there are some clients that seem to prefer that capitalization. Like another aspect of capitalization is job titles. So I think some people think that if their job title is capitalized, it sounds more official. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not always possibly to be consistent, but with headlines, we definitely try to change the capitalization. What should I do if I get sent a text for proofreading, but it's very poorly written and probably needs stylistic changes? That's another very good question. So I would say in that case, it's important to let your language manager know or let the client know that the text really needs, really should be edited. So it should be changed stylistically. In some cases, a text might read a bit weirdly, but they still don't want to make any stylistic changes. And that will maybe be because that's already been approved by a legal department or, a CEO or something. In that case, I would still just do a straight proofreading. So don't make stylistic changes because, there could be a legal reason behind why something is worded in a vague way. Steve Gray, yes, I've just checked under options and you have to check the box auto-propagate exact matches to confirm segments if you want all the identical segments in the text to be changed when you change one of them. Okay. One proofreading tip. Francis, you mentioned that social media is not a great source, but I find that it can be helpful to check someone's LinkedIn for the correct spelling of their name, especially in business contexts. Yeah, so I think for names of people, LinkedIn, I would say, don't use it as a news source maybe, but it's great for checking names. Okay, some more tips. I have a few tips to share. From Dorothy, I proofread a text, as Frances said. I proofread a text, as Frances said, usually in the morning, and I find it helpful to leave it for a few hours and then read it through again. This also applies to translations before they go to the proofreader. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are also some tips specifically related to self-revision. And like one of those is, like Dorothy said, to sort of sleep on it. So finish text, then take a break from it, and then look at it again with fresh eyes. Another thing you can do, what I've heard, this is for self-revision specifically, is to actually, when you go through your text again, to look at it backwards. So in Trotos, read the sentences from the way up, and it kind of breaks down the sentences in such a way that, if you read from top to bottom, it's easy to kind of just get into the flow. You miss little typos, but if it's broken up in that way, you can sometimes catch typos that you wouldn't if you were just reading it from top to bottom. Another one, how do I deal with proofreading jobs in programs without markup or track changes functions like Excel or PowerPoint? Yeah, this is something that comes up a lot. First, I would check with the client or language manager to see if they really need the track changes. So if they really want to see the changes, sometimes it's just easier to enter the changes directly. If they do want the changes shown, in Excel, there are two different methods. So you can either change the color of a text, or, so if you make a change, you just highlight that in a green or some color that the client can see. What you can also do is have a separate column. So you have the original unedited text in the first column, and then add another column with the new edited text. Or you can combine both those options. For PowerPoint, there really isn't a way to show text changes besides changing the color. But I would say that's something that it can be annoying for a client to change all the color back. So I really wouldn't do that unless the client is really specifically says they want those changes highlighted. And even in that case, I would maybe also create a clean version without the colors. Okay. I've got a tip to trick your brain into thinking it is seeing something completely new. Very useful when rereading your own work as a translator, but also for a second or third run of a text you're tackling as a proofreader editor. Change the way it looks. Adjust the font color, e.g. in Word, or invert Windows colors, which would work in any program, including a CAT tool. And this way you can look at it with a fresh mind. Yeah, that's a great tip. Are there any schools or institutions offering workshops or proofreading training? Yeah, so there are a few. So in Switzerland, there's the Zürcher Hochschule für angewendete Wissenschaften. I know they have a proofreading program. The ITI, the Translators Association in the UK, will occasionally offer workshops on proofreading. I saw that they actually have one coming up in summer, one in February, and then also one in summer. And there are a few other ones. I'd have to do a little bit of research, but I can come up with a list and send those out in a newsletter afterwards. Have you had any experience with Grammarly or Perfected at all? So I am a little bit, so I actually went to a copywriting conference a few years ago, and I remember they were really pushing Grammarly. I personally haven't really played around with it. I know we had one client at one point that would put our translations into Grammarly and say, oh, but Grammarly said that it's better this way. And it wasn't really better the other way. I tend to be a little bit skeptical about these like automated style grammar checks. it's kind of like the grammar check in Word, where often its suggestions just don't really make sense. So I'm a little bit skeptical of it, especially because I get so many ads for it. But they could definitely be useful, and maybe I'm just being unfair. Also, here's a list of words that I always mistype that are also words, so won't get found by the spell checker. Of, on, will, with, chose, choose, and, an, out, our. Yeah, I think that's a great idea to have a list of commonly misspelled words that aren't checked by aren't caught by a spell checker. If a link is not already localized, should I translate it and offer a suggestion? So yeah, if you see a link and it's not localized, so you can tell if it's localized by going. Sometimes you can just change the language at the top. So if it's in German, you can change the language to English to see what the English URL is. I would say if it's not translated, don't even bother translating it. Just leave a comment for the client and say this link needs to be localized, because they might have their own restrictions for how a URL should look. So in that case, just leave a comment. I use Antidote for French and English. It's so useful. So maybe there are some of these tools that work well for people. So yeah, again, I myself don't have experience with these, but that's a tool that you all might find useful. Antidote. I might be mispronouncing it. Is it ever okay to make stylistic changes in a proofreading job? Yeah, so this is a good question. I think there are two instances in which it is okay to make stylistic changes. I would say in both cases, you would still want to, because it's specifically a proofreading job, you'd maybe want to leave this as a comment rather than just doing it in the text. But the two instances I would say are if something is really unclear. So if something just really doesn't make sense, then offer a suggestion for something that does make sense. The other thing I would say is if it's text that could be perceived as offensive. In that case, I would offer a suggestion and explain why the wording that's already in the text might be considered problematic. Regarding errors and poor writing style in a source text, do you think that the translator should correct and improve or render things imperfectly? Yeah, this is a great question, because I think Supertext really kind of expects translators to improve the writing of a text. It's obviously not always possible, and it's not. Yeah, this may be more of a translation question than a proofreading question. But I think for translation, we do kind of expect the target text to read as well as it possibly can. You still don't want to change the meaning of the source text, but the idea is you really want the text at the end to be a pleasure to read. And that's also Supertext's mission, which is to rid the world of bad copy. So I would say you should try to improve the style as much as you can. Again, yeah, not always possible, and there's not always a time for it, but yes. I agree with Dorothy about coming back to a proofreading job after several hours with a fresh mind. I notice you're against sticky notes on Adobe to proofread PDF texts. I'm afraid I'm guilty of doing this, but perhaps I need to bone up on other uses of Adobe. So yeah, with sticky notes, they can be useful for just adding a comment to a text. But yeah, I would suggest kind of just playing around in Adobe and looking at the different tools. So like I said, it's actually easier to use the markup tools I mentioned than sticky notes, because with sticky notes you have to add the sticky note, sort of type the whole exactly what you want the person implementing the changes to do, whereas with the specific markup tools. There are different tools for each like each change you want to make. So if you want to insert, you could literally just put your cursor where you want to insert a word and start typing, and it'll automatically show the right markup tool. So it's actually easier to do it that way than to add a sticky note and type the whole change there. Are there any other questions or tips? Here's one. Watch out for the next series of so there's a BDU seminar on revision. So there you go. I would say the BDU, ITI, a lot of these other translation institutions will offer. Occasionally they'll offer modules on proofreading, but they're not always consistent. So make sure to sign up for them as soon as they show up. I know, like for example, the workshop I was mentioning it with the ITI, the first session actually sold out really quickly, and so they ended up creating another session in July. So if you see something like that that's of interest to you, then sign up for it as soon as it shows up. Units of measurement. Should I localize a unit, e.g. pressure, PSI into bar, if the translator didn't do that? Yeah, that's a really good question. That's something where I'd really check with a client before changing anything. And units are an area where it can get really Like you can fall into a few traps. Like for example, in the US, you have ton, and in the UK, you have metric tons, and they're different. They're slightly different. Also, something like horsepower. There's metric horsepower, and there's like imperial horsepower, and they're different. So I would say be really careful about units, and do not change them, do not localize them unless you have specifically asked the client, should I localize them? Some clients do seem to kind of expect it, so I would really try to clear that up in advance, but I personally am against changing that unless it's been specifically requested by the client. Another tip for PDFs, PDF Exchange Viewer instead of Adobe. It has highlighting, cross-out, typewriter tools, and much more. Okay, so I'm not as familiar with Exchange Viewer, but that could be another option. Not a question, but I would like to thank you. Thank you. And I'm very glad to hear that. Any final questions? One more. How would you address the issue of translations of names of associations or similar organizations when proofreading? Should they remain potentially incomprehensible in the source language, or should a translation be offered, particularly if a translation does not already exist? This is from Phil. So I think it's good to always offer a suggestion. So if there isn't already, I would first search for an official translation. If an official translation doesn't exist, I would use the German or the original language as the title, and then put a suggested translation in brackets and parentheses afterwards. So the reason I would offer both is because usually if someone is looking for that organization, like, oh, I saw that organization mentioned here, they're going to look it up in Google. So you don't want to offer a translation that when you look it up, it's not going to come up with specifically the institution that was referred to in the text. So I would have the source text and then offer a translation in brackets. And another, thank you for your very interesting webinar. Okay. Yep. Any other final questions? Will we receive a certificate of attendance for this webinar? I would really appreciate receiving it by email. Yeah, that's something I can do. I also wanted to send out a like a questionnaire about the webinar in general afterwards with a newsletter, just so you can give feedback on what you appreciated and what you would prefer. Thank you. Okay, yes. So someone asked if you could get the presentation. So I'll make a PDF of the slides. If you would like the slides as this PDF format, email me directly and then I can send those to you. I'm not going to publish them publicly, and I also would please ask that you don't disseminate them further, so they're just for personal use. Any other final questions? Okay, so in that case, I am going to say goodbye and close the webinar. If you do have any questions related to proofreading that come to you later, just write directly to my email address and I can answer them by email. In that case, I'll close off I'll say goodbye, and thank you so much for attending. I'm really glad that so many people decided to join. So many more people signed up than I was expecting to, so thank you so much. And bye.